Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 4, Sensation and Perception. And we're going to get into talking about some of the different senses, but for this set of notes, we're going to talk about sight. And so as we go along, you're going to notice that there are several part twos. There will be a part two for hearing and a part two for other senses. So try to keep them straight as we go along here. So we're going to get into talking a little bit about vision and kind of going through some of the basic terminology and what actually happens as we're processing sight. So first thing we need to talk about is wet vision. This is how our nervous system, for the most part, is processing light. And, when we talk about the anatomy of visual sensation, light or the eye gathers light, it focuses it and it converts it into some kind of neural signal, and the signal is sent on all the way to the visual cortex of the brain. To make that happen, we have to start with the sense receptors. And so we have to start with the retina. This is the thin, sensitive layer at the back of the eye that contains the photoreceptors. And for the most part, these photoreceptors are basically in two different parts. We have our photoreceptors, for the most part, that are sensitive cells in the retina that convert light energy into neural impulses. And they usually take the form of either rods, which are the photoreceptors that are sensitive to dim light. In other words, they are looking at basically dark and light images, or black and white, if you want to call it that. We have far more rods, roughly 125 million different rods in the retina. The others are the cones. These are the photoreceptors that are sensitive to color, and they're kind of shaped like a cone, hence the name cones. And we have roughly 7 million cones in comparison. Now, when we look at these cones, typically they are sensitive to blue, green, and red. But the deal is, between blue, green, and red, we can make all the other colors in the spectrum, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. The sharpest area within the retina is actually the fovea, and that is where we typically try to focus a lot of the things that we're looking at, because that is where we're going to have the highest concentration of cones and the best area of our sharpest vision. Okay, within the retina, to process this information back into a neural impulse, we have to have what is called bipolar cells. They collect the impulses from the photoreceptors and shuttle them on to ganglion cells that, for the most part, form the optic nerve. A lot of times we talk about it in terms of like ganglion axons, because they're kind of longer axons, and they have a tendency to be wired from the optic nerve, crossing into the opposite hemisphere. So if I'm looking at something from my left eye, that will cross into the right hemisphere of my brain, passing through the thalamus and then onto the visual cortex within that same hemisphere. The area where the optic nerve enters the eye is that area called the blind spot, because there is basically no photoreceptors. Most often we don't recognize that it exists unless we're looking at something and we purposely put it in that item into the area where we're focusing. Then we'll notice that blind spot. And then finally, the visual cortex. This is located in the occipital lobe. It's part of the brain that processes the neural impulses into visual sensations. When we talk about the anatomy of the eye, I mean, we've kind of discussed some of this in the past in our intro class, but basically the basic items are the cornea, which is kind of that transparent protective coating of the eye. Behind that is the pupil, That is the muscle that controls, or I should say, the iris, which is the muscle that controls the size of the pupil. Pupil is kind of like kind of a black hole, if you want to call it that, and that kind of gives way to the lens where we're going to focus that light. It passes and it is kind of flipped and it will land on the retina. That's where we have those photoreceptors of rods and cones. I mentioned before the fovea is the highest area of concentration of cones. And then we have our blind spot, which is the area where there are no photoreceptors, and our optic nerve, which travels back to the visual cortex. Okay, on your diagrams in your note packet, you're going to have to do a little flip-flopping here because I think I have written this down wrong. But when we talk about people who are farsighted or nearsighted, some of this is all a matter of how you're focusing light back onto the retina. So typically, people who are farsighted have a tendency to basically focus the light beyond the retina itself. Hence, things that are really close up have a tendency to be really, really blurry. And a way to correct that is to use some kind of corrective lens that would change the focus point back to the retina. Typically, the lenses are going to be a little thicker in the sense that they will kind of magnify the image. A lot of times when people get older, they have to have reading glasses, and that's kind of part of this. Usually about the time that you hit your 40s, people are going to start struggling with this a little bit. Nearsightedness, again, another issue as far as how you're going to focus light back onto the retina, but the tendency is that because of some issues with the lens, the image doesn't quite reach the back of the retina, kind of falls a little short. And hence, again, corrective lenses will help project that back to the back of the retina so that it's sharper. And then finally, we have normal vision, which I think if you flip your description for A and C, you'll get the right ones here. But normal vision, the lens for the most part is actually focusing right onto the retina. So when we talk about the visual cortex, our ganglion axon for the most part, there we go. Occipital, our visual cortex, this is located in the occipital lobe of the brain. It is where the brain begins to transform incoming neural impulses into visual sensations. The ganglion axons, as you can see, that go from the left eye here back to the thalamus in the right hemisphere. They, for the most part, will have an area of synapse, as you can kind of see this little gap here. And eventually that's going to run back into the visual cortex where it will be processed. All right, vision system. Brightness, for the most part, this is a psychological sensation caused by the intensity of light. It comes from the intensity or the amplitude of the light itself. You can have your color or your hue. This is a psychological sensation created in the brain from information obtained from the eyes, from the wavelengths of the visible light, not necessarily of the external world. So it is something, when we talk about color, it is something that is processed by the brain, not necessarily the environment, even though it seems like it should be the other way around. The electromagnetic spectrum, which we're going to take a look here in a moment, this is the entire range of electromagnetic energy. This includes things like gamma rays, radio waves, X-rays, microwaves, and the visible light, which makes kind of a tiny portion of that spectrum. And in the visible spectrum, it's that tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that we actually can see. It varies from mammals to mammal. But our ability to see color is pretty good in comparison to other mammals. So when we take a look at that, when we talk about gamma rays, these are probably one of the shortest rays. They have a basically a length of about the diameter of an atom, so you know that it's very microscopic. When we talk about radio waves or your broadcasting bands, they can be as long as a mile. So I mean, it really kind of goes to the spectrum, so to speak. The narrow band of wavelength visible to the human eye extends from the shorter waves, which are like the blue violet rays, to the longer red rays for the most part. And we'll kind of take a look at this when we get into talking about um, the notion of hearing when we talk about things. As far as the terminology, you're going to see kind of a visual of that that's going to kind of go back to the wavelengths, and you'll kind of see what I'm talking about here. But sensing color, there's some different theories. There's the trichromatic theory. This is the idea that colors are sensed by three different types of cones sensitive to light, which we kind of mentioned before, like the red, the blue, the green waves. And for the most part, all other colors are going to be kind of made from that. So if you look below, there's like a little color wheel, and you can kind of see kind of a simplistic version of this. You have the opponent process theory. This is the idea that our cells in the visual system are kind of in complementary pairs, like red and green, blue and yellow. And this explains sensation from the bipolar cells. And an example of that would be maybe this illusion that you've taken a look at. The idea is that you have to stare kind of at the center of either one of these flags, and with a certain amount of intensity. And then at some point, you're going to shift your attention to the white area where the dot is. The goal here is, by staring at these images over a period of time, you're going to tire the neural responses to black, green, and yellow. And what should happen is that you see the opponent, which is the red, white, and blue. So give it a shot. You can see if it works or not. So when we talk about that, we got to also talk about color blindness. This is a genetic disorder. It prevents some people from discriminating certain colors. I think a lot of times we hear about the red, green, but even people who are not diagnosed with color blindness can have some color sensitivities. Typically, as we get older, like, it's harder to distinguish darker colors. So if we have black, a dark gray, a dark brown, a dark blue, sometimes it's really easy to get them all mixed up. But most people have difficulty distinguishing any kind of color in dim light. So the question is, what do you see here? Individuals with red-green color blindness would have a hard time distinguishing the image that's in the middle here. Okay. Typically, if you have normal vision, you might see a number 7 and a number 4. But red-green color blindness, it is probably the most common form of diagnosed color blindness. There are some others. In some rarer cases, you have like a yellow-blue color blindness. And the most rare of all, with a very small documentation of cases, are situations where people have no color whatsoever, meaning that they pretty much see things as kind of in a black and white kind of world. But that's probably the most extreme by far. Thank you very much.